Chapter 17. The regiment leaves Meryton. The second week of their return was the last of the regiment's stay in Meryton, and all the young ladies in the neighbourhood were in the lowest of spirits. Only the older Mrs. Bennet were still able to eat, drink, and sleep, and to continue the usual course of their lives. Very frequently they were charged with heartlessness by Kitty and Lydia, whose own unhappiness was extreme. "Heavens, what will become of us?" they would often cry in bitterness. "How can you be smiling so, Lizzie?" Their fond mother shared all their unhappiness. She remembered what she had suffered on a similar occasion in her youth. "I am sure," she said, "that I cried for 2 days when Colonel Miller's regiment went away. I thought that my heart would break." "I'm sure that mine will break," said Lydia. "If only we could go to Brighton," said Mrs. Bennet. "Oh yes, but father is so disagreeable." Such were the complaints continually repeated at Longbourn House. Elizabeth tried to be amused by them, but all sense of pleasure was lost in shame. She felt once more the justice of Mr. Darcy's criticisms, and she had never been so ready to pardon his part in the affairs of his friend. But the darkness of Lydia's future was lightened shortly afterwards. She received an invitation from Mrs. Forster, the wife of the colonel of the regiment, to go with her to Brighton. This friend was a young woman, and very recently married. The joy of Lydia on this occasion, the pleasure of Mrs. Bennet, and the jealous anger of Kitty are hardly to be described. Without any concern for her sister's feelings, Lydia flew about the house in restless excitement, calling for everybody's congratulations, and laughing and talking with more violence than ever, while the luckless Kitty continued to complain. "I cannot see why Mrs. Forster did not ask me as well as Lydia," she said. "I have just as much right to be asked as she has, and more too because I am 2 years older." Elizabeth tried to make her more reasonable, and Jane urged her to bear her disappointment quietly, but without success. As for Elizabeth herself, she considered this invitation as the death blow to any possibility of common sense in Lydia, and though such an act would make her hated if it became known, she could not help secretly advising her father not to let her go. She suggested to him the probability of Lydia's being even more foolish with such a companion at Brighton, where the opportunities for silliness must be greater than at home. "If you knew," said Elizabeth, "of the very great disadvantage which has already come from the public notice of Lydia's uncontrolled behaviour, I am sure that you would judge it unwise to let her go." "Already come?" repeated Mr. Bennet. "What, has she frightened away some of your lovers? Poor little Lizzie! But do not be disheartened. Young men who cannot bear to be connected with a little silliness are not worth worrying over." But Elizabeth, excusing herself for speaking so plainly to her father, continued in her attempt to persuade him of the growing lack of self-control that both his younger daughters showed in public, and the danger of their characters becoming fixed. He saw that her whole heart was in the subject, and taking her hand warmly, said in reply, "Do not make yourself anxious, my love. Wherever you and Jane are known, you must be respected and valued, and you will not appear to less advantage because you have a pair of, or may I say 3, very silly sisters. We shall have no peace at home if Lydia does not go to Brighton. Let her go, then. Colonel Forster is a sensible man, and will keep her from any real harm. And she is luckily too poor to attract any fortune hunters. At Brighton she will be of less importance than here. Let us hope, therefore, that it may teach her a little about life." With this answer, Elizabeth was forced to be satisfied. Elizabeth now saw Wickham for the last time. Having met him frequently since her return, she had become fairly well used to the situation. Her interest in him had quite gone, and in his present behaviour to herself, she had a fresh cause for displeasure. The readiness that he soon showed in renewing his attention to her, now that Miss King had gone, proved that he judged her to be foolish enough to be pleased by notice from him at any time that he chose to give it. On the very last day of the regiment's stay, he had dinner with some other officers at Longbourn. Elizabeth was so unwilling to part from him in a friendly way that she mentioned the fact that Colonel Fitzwilliam and Mr. Darcy had both spent 3 weeks at Rosings, and asked him whether he was acquainted with the former. He looked surprised, displeased, anxious, but controlling himself, soon replied that he had formerly seen him often, and asked how she liked him. She answered warmly in his favour, and went on to say that from knowing Mr. Darcy better, he, too, was better understood and liked. Wickham's anxiety now appeared in a reddened face and a troubled look. He did not dare to say much more, but in spite of an appearance of cheerfulness, it was clear that he would now be glad to leave the area. When the party ended, Lydia returned with Mrs. Forster to Meryton, from which place they would set out early the next morning. The separation between her and her family was noisy rather than painful. Kitty was the only one to cry, and her tears were from jealousy and from pity for herself. In the loud happiness of Lydia herself in saying goodbye, the more gentle last words of her sisters were spoken without being heard.